Hey there folks. So in this video what we're going to do is we're going to look to progress our character a little bit further, because at the moment they do move around and we can look around them, but obviously they're just standing in that T-pose. So we're going to use the animations that we've created in other videos and bring them in here and look at how we can actually have it so when we're standing still we're idle, and when we're pressing any of the keys we can be moving around across the floor. Okay, so to start with, what we're going to need is we're going to need some kind of animation holder that's going to allow us to decide which of these animations we're actually going to use. And the asset that we use for that is something that's called an animation blueprint. It's very similar to the other blueprints we may have seen, but this one's handling animation. It handles it by actually deciding what state, so which animations we might be using, and then it can be used to apply this onto our character. So I'm in my Synty animations folder here where I've retargeted all these ones. These are the third person character ones, so the mannequin Manny animations that have just been retargeted to run on Synty instead. I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to go animation blueprint. Now the first thing the animation blueprint is going to ask you is which skeleton would you like to use for this. Now that's really great because we know that lots of skeletal meshes can be on the same skeleton, and we can make one animation blueprint linked to that skeleton, which then all of those skeletal meshes can use. Or we can have lots of animation blueprints. So we could have an animation blueprint for a specific type of movement or a specific type of weapon, and then they can all be linked to that skeleton as well. So I know that all of these are using this exact one here, this character dummy. I know that because all of these are weapons or money. But if you are unsure, if you've got loads of asset packs that are in here, what you can do is go and have a look. So we're going to go into characters, we'll find any of these mannequins. So I know that the one I'm using at the moment is this dummy male, and I can have a look here. If I was to look at his skeleton, you can see he's using scale underscore character dummy female. Okay, so really quick and easy way to go and find out that one, and then so just come back in here to create that again, and that's the one that I want to be selecting from this list. Okay, so I'm going to create this now. I'm going to give it a name, so I'm going to go with ABP underscore, and we'll just go with base character for now, and we can expand this out as we look at different versions, different weapons, different abilities in the future. Now I'm going to double click that and open it, and we're just going to go through what is actually in an animation blueprint. Over on the left hand side here we have our viewport, and now this is going to be really useful because it displays the actual animation that we're previewing. So if I just, for now, just going to drag this in, I'm going to explain this in a moment, but if I just drag in an animation, so let's just take in this idle here and just plug it into this result and compile, you can see that this is always going to be showing me a preview of what's coming out of the end, the output. So this bit here over on the right, the bit we just messed with, we've got this anim graph. And the anim graph has one node at the start, the output pose, and it decides what animation pose should we be using. And that could be as simple as what I've done here of applying one animation, and that's the animation that gets applied to the whole skeleton. Or it could be something really complicated where it takes different animations, combines them together. Maybe it blends animations, so as we're landing, it uses a land animation that combines with movement. Or maybe we have different animations for the top half of our body versus the bottom half. But for now, I've got that animation working. And the other bit that we've got in here, we've got this event graph. You can see that we have nodes very similar to other event graphs. We're going to talk about these in a bit, and we're going to use this to get data from the character this is assigned to and use that to determine what animation should be used here in the anim graph. On the right hand side, we've got our details panel. So anytime we select things, you can see that that's obviously going to be contextualized based on the thing that we have. The bottom right, we have our asset browser. So these are the lists of all of the assets that this skeleton has available to it. Now, obviously, if you haven't gone through and retargeted some animations, it could be that the skeleton you're using, the skeletal mesh you're displaying here, might not have animations available. So you need to go and have a look at how to do retargeting and how to get animations onto your one. We also have this other tab here called the Anim Preview Editor. And what we're going to be able to do here is start actually editing the preview. So providing this with values to see what it looks like if we were to say, what does it do if I'm in the air or if I'm moving at a certain speed? On the bottom left, we've got things that are very familiar when working with our event graphs, so the My Blueprint section. So you can see here we've got the anim graphs and the event graphs. This is a really useful area here because it allows us to quickly jump around inside of our anim graph, because as this becomes more complicated with different states, they'll all be listed here. We also have functions that we can call, variables that we can track, and a whole bunch of other like blueprint functionality we might want to do. Okay, so let's just pause this here with a compile and pop out for a sec. So if I press play at this point, what you can see is our character is now playing that idle animation. Obviously, if I move around, they haven't been told to use any of the other animations like walk or run, but we can see that they are actually playing the animation. Also, they are only playing it once, so after they've played it just the once, they'll stop completely static in the last frame of it. So we're going to have to fix that as well. Okay, so we have the idle animation playing, but let's have a look at how we can actually take this a little bit further and have moving in there, such as this run forward and this walk forward. How can we get those animations actually playing as well? Well, in our animation blueprint, at the moment, I'm just telling the anim graph to take this animation and just output that one thing here. But if I was to go and take a second animation like walk forward, if I plug that in, you can see I can only ever have one output that's going into here. So we need to start looking at how we can actually create some kind of condition that decides whether we are doing this one or this one. Now we might find some simple tutorials that do things where you might blend by a boolean, such as like, am I moving or not? But we're going to need something a little bit more complex because our character is going to have walking, they're going to have running, they might have crouch, jumping, landing, falling. So we're going to need something that's going to determine what state we're actually in. And that's something called a state machine. So if you type in, right click and type in state machine. And the first one I'm going to do is just going to be our ground locomotion. And this is going to be something that's going to contain all of the decision making for what we're doing when we're on the floor, whether we are idle, whether we're walking, whether we're running, whether we're crouching and stuff as well. And I'm going to plug that into my output phase. And I can actually take these away now. So now here, if I go into that, you can see now up at the top, I've gone from my base character into their anim graph inside of the ground locomotion state machine. And then this is a little bit different because this has an entry point. And as we come in here, we're basically going to go around a bunch of states to determine what the actual value is that's coming out of here. And to do that, we right click and we're going to look for a state. So add state. And this one, we're going to call it idle. I'm going to plug it in. You can only have one connection from entry into idle. And if I double click on that idle, you can see inside of here, this has a very similar output result. So this is where I'm going to plug in the idle animation. Okay, so plug that in. And now what's actually happening if we were to compile is nothing changes over here, but essentially it goes into this state machine. It goes in through this entry. It enters this one as the first state, the idle state, the one that I'm always going to keep on looping to. And inside of there, it chooses to play this idle animation. Okay, let's just go and test that. And what we should see is it's working exactly the same. Except for the fact, obviously, it's potentially going to stop playing and it's going to not keep on looping. There you go. So it stopped. Now that, what we might need to do for that one is actually go to that animation and start thinking about how we can make it looping. So here, if we go down, we've got this loop animation. So I've selected the animation player here and go to loop animation and tick that. And you can see that this will now continually loop. Another little tip is maybe you don't have to do this, but if you go to this bind value, you could go to expose as pin. You don't have to do that, but it is useful sometimes when you're working with other people just to know what they have set those values to, because that is a very quick visual indicator that this one has this variable turned on. You're not going to plug anything into it or change it, but it's going to let you know. Okay, so let's just go back to play again. And this time when I play, I'm just going to wait for a moment and see. And it would have been around this point that it would stop, but now you can see it's just going to keep on looping that animation all the time. So as I'm moving around, it's still playing it and still looping it. So my character's still got movement. Okay, so with that done, the next thing that we're going to do then is start looking at how we can make our character go into other states. So I want to have another state here. I'm going to call this one, let's go with walk run. We'll put walk in there for now, but we might add run to this later. And we need to know how to go from this state into this state. Well, we can add arrows, and these arrows allow us, if we drag from one state to another, they allow us to basically transfer and move from this state into this one. And we can drag them in both directions. So I can have this one that says, I want to go along here into this one, but I also want to be able to go back from this one back into this one. The little circle you see is called a transition rule. So that's the reason that we would be allowed to go from here to here. So with idle to walk and run, this is a very simple one, because what it is going to be, am I actually moving? Is there a speed greater than 0? If there's a speed greater than 0, then go to walk and run. And if there isn't, go back to idle. Now at the moment, we've got nothing to actually tell us what we should do with that actual idle walk and run. So let's just go in here into the walk run first. And let's just put in the walk forward animation. So we've got something to move between. And let's go and think, how can we actually get these movement values? How can we get our current speed? Well, for that, what we're going to do is actually go over to our event graph, because we want to get data and values from the character this is assigned to. We want to know how quick that character is moving. So there's a couple of things we're going to do in here now to actually get that value. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually know what character owns this animation blueprint. What character has this assigned to them? So if we go and right click and type in it, we can go and find event blueprint initialize animation. So this is going to run when this animation blueprint is first initialized. You might also see tutorials that are using begin play. Just be careful with begin play, because sometimes we don't have an exact order of when these begin plays are going to run, and it might be that you get an access non error for the first 1 or 2 frames when maybe this doesn't run as quick as this runs. We're going to sort that with a is valid check in a moment, but just be careful with that one. That's the difference with these. Update animation is kind of like our tick. It's going to keep on going every single frame and updating our animation, which is something we want, because obviously our character is going to be constantly moving, falling, jumping and stuff. So we need to know what they're always doing. Okay, so rather than using this try get pawn owner over here, let's use it in our initialize animation over here. Now the try get pawn owner, what you can see here is it's outputting a pawn. Now pawn, we can get velocity from this, we can know how fast this pawn is moving, but a pawn is not a character. Remember, all characters are pawns, but not all pawns are going to be characters, which means we don't have access with this output here to the character movement component. So we won't be able to get things like the character's walk speed, whether they're moving, falling and stuff. And also, it's not our exact character. So if we put functionality in there, such as are they aiming, are they prone, are they flying and swimming and stuff, then we won't be able to get that even from character. We need to get our specific character. So a good practice here is going to be to actually cast to, and I'm going to cast to my base character. What this is going to do, because it's only going to run once when we initialize, it's going to say, okay, let's look at what the actual owner of this animation blueprint is. We're going to convert it from a pawn into a base character. So we're going to say, is it assigned to this thing? And if it is, we're just going to promote that to a variable. So you can see here now I've got a variable, which is going to be my character reference. Another one you might want to do, and you don't have to do this one, but you might search off of this and go search for movement. And you can see down here, then we have this get character movement. You don't have to do this one, but sometimes rather than having to constantly get character reference to get character movement, you might cut out the middleman of having to do that by just getting it right at the start and creating a reference to it. Okay, so that's our references set up. That allows us at the start of the game to get a reference to our base character and get a reference to their movement component. Now what we can do is we can start looking at getting some of these values to determine how they should be used. So I'm going to just drag in my character reference here. So I've gone over to variables, clicked it and drag it in. I'm going to go with a get. And what you could do a get and then check is valid. So the one with the question mark. And you could just say, is this thing actually valid? Have I actually got a reference to a character yet? But if you're just doing that, what you could also do is you can right click a reference and you can convert it to a validated get, which is the same thing. You know, we've got the is valid and the is not valid, and we've got a reference to the character reference here. So from the character reference, I'm going to drag off of that and I'm going to search for velocity. Remember velocity, down at the bottom here, it's going to tell me which direction my character's moving in and how quickly they're moving in. That's why it's a vector value. So we're going to get an X, Y, Z of the movement. Are they moving forwards, sideways, upwards? And the value, the actual number itself, is going to determine how quick that movement's going to be. Now that's okay, but it's not a singular value telling me how quick I'm moving. So for that, what we need to do is a vector length. And imagine this as an imaginary line that's just being drawn from where we were to where we are now. And that line, as we draw it, the longer that line is, the quicker we're moving, because obviously we're traveling over more space. So we've got vector length, the default one here, and vector length XY. Vector length is fine, but it does take into account all three values, so the X, Y, and Z. Now in my case, with what I'm building here, the Z is actually going to be governed by things like falling, it's going to be governed by jumping, and so I don't actually want to be using the Z value because I don't want that to be in any way influence my speed for determining whether I should be walking or running. So I'm going to just use vector length XY, which will determine how I'm moving across the floor. And you can see what that has done as it's converted this vector into a float, so a single float value. And I'm going to right click that and I'm going to promote that to a variable and call it speed. So every single frame, it's going to be checking and saying, get the velocity of my character, see how quick they're moving on the ground, and let's save that into a variable called speed. Okay, now I've just compiled, you can see there's some errors over here, and that's the thing we now need to go and fix. So if we go over here to our animation graph, so you might be here in the anim graph, you might be here inside of the state machine, you might be here inside of an actual state, just jump back through the breadcrumbs here. And if we look here where we can see idle to walk run, the errors we're getting over here, or the warnings we're getting over here, are saying there is a transition, there's a rule here that lets me go from this state to this state, but there's no actual rule here to determine whether we can actually do that. There's nothing inside of this to control that. So if I double click on that, you can see, am I allowed to enter this transition? It's a Boolean, so it's a true or false. Can I go into here? Well, let's just look at our speed and say, well, let's get the speed. Is our speed greater than 0? Yeah, if it's greater than 0, we're moving. You can put a little bit of value in here, maybe advance this later by having things like slight kind of movement of the feet if it's very small values. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple. If I am moving, if my speed is greater than 0, then I am allowed to go from here into here. And you can actually hover over these and see what those transitions are. I've got to do the opposite direction. And this one will just go with speed. And we could do less than or equal to. I mean, it's going to always be equal because if we're moving, it's just going to be equal. But I'll do less than or equal to just in case there's any kind of weird consistencies with the floats where the float values aren't perfectly meeting up with 0. And that means that anything else other than being greater than 0 will go back to idle. So the last thing to check with this, just before we go any further and go back to test it in the game, is going to be over here in this anim preview editor. So you can see now that all of this is compiled, it's all green with a tick. I've got this option here with my speed, and I can use this to test out values. Okay, so they're not going to be the greatest values. We're going to fix that in the next video. But at this point now, if I press play, I've got my character. Their velocity is 0 because they're not moving, so they stand still. And if I move, they walk, and then they return back to 0. And as long as I keep on walking, they will keep on playing, except the animation will stop eventually. So we're just going to fix this just as we did with the idle. So we go back into here, we find that animation state for walk run, and we tell it to loop the animation. So if it plays and it plays all the way to the end, let's tell it to keep on looping. Okay, so that we'll leave that there for now. We've got idle animation. We've got our walking animation, so as long as we're walking around, we'll keep on playing this. And in the next video, what we're going to do is try and smooth out the blend between these, so it's not immediate, like I move from idle straight into walk. And maybe we'll have a little bit of control for adding in a run as well. Thanks for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing to access more of my Unreal Engine content.